and set position on levels. D screens calculate lines at D factors, screen location setting and surface. Processor indicate position location or X, Y, Z through platforms over X lines or Y. What I'm saying in lines of travel is calculate and modify how we see yourself through Ethereum. Ethereum line is process how you come into your echo flames, your screen lines, adaptations of flux, the processor core centers and observation of your scanners, gets in communication positions of bounds, how you decentralize and you centralize your system and calculations. Now, understanding that, it's true to understand how this is all set up in the universal streaming, knowing exactly how to see that in travel. So let's just get into the basics and just into line screen adaptations, just to a pyramid. This is a pyramid, right? Okay, as it moves itself in position. Its clocking system is all lines of settings, but everything line course centers decentralized and centralized. We have to get out of everything lines of position to come into the line conditions to its eon flux, into the quantum flux. Now that process locations when it comes on X lines of channel. And online setters and on communications. So set communication lines of grounds to surface, properties over equity. And line screen adaptations of travel comes in position locations to all set calculation. Starts with that settings in travel, right? And then basically all you're doing is you're creating platforms, okay, and set lines and positions all through travel, okay? So everything is in lines of clocking lines, process line, direct locations. Everything has to go back to one number. That correlates the setting into all levels, all through set calculations. Let's just start with zeros and ones and platforms and travel. Okay, but you have to understand how this all works in set positions calculations. So I get a 0, 1, 0. I get a 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1. I get a 1, 0. Right? So that's tablets and tablets, location setting, the process calculates lines and high position deposits. Now, there's an ecoform change that we have to understand how to liquidize our systems. So let's start off with the carbon, set position location silicone. So calculation lines position of crystalline, which is with a K, not a C. So make sure you understand that through Kilo Mike. All right, and then we come into all those anti-mantle. And then we come in positional locations into carrion, into Elter Skelter. All right, that's an alteration mind fix. It's a fixation locations to your set course centers of calculation setting to deposits, into your CODs, your CDs, your position location, your systems, all through tractions, your constellation lines, your alignments, screen adaptation of levels, cubicle line, rotation lines of grounds, on sequence, on communication, on pi. When you bring everything down to one number, it's a decentralized to centralized settings that comes in crystalline to liquidization of your assets. And set lines of travel and set position. Okay, how that's set up, right? So carbon base over lines over 0, 1 over 1, rotation lines of grounds, locations, platforms over lines, into assets over lines, platforms over E factors, platform over C over travel. Okay, so that process lines position. So what you're creating is a liquidization lines of assets that process E factors over E transfer or transactions of transistors over translations into transcribe. So you have to stand the position of its box frame, triangulation in that position to its positions, where you triangulate positions all through trifactor that box it in locates to its cycle. So in that course centers, there's an E factors over line. Now that process course centers come into lines of travel. So you have to get out of the carbon, come into the silicone, which is a 24 cycle. Set 0, 1s on lines, say 24 line. Okay, equals lines, liquidize into crystalline. And you have to put it in lines set location in position of square root to triangulation lines of flux. Now that process lines into its deposit location of E cards. Now it's existing line position location when it constellates its system to the atmosphere's line screen adaptation and liquidations. Comes into your assets, process course centers, and E transfers. Now the transactions comes in position location of E force. Remember, everything E is existing. That formulates a clocking system into a levels. So liquidized setting is a decentralized to centralized and setting to your financial system. Now you have to understand how it comes into that science, and then you come into the anti-mantle. Okay, then you come into the anti-carrion, and then you come into the Elter Skelter. That mind shifts the lines of the alteration lines of space, lines of time share, time locks, time screen, time pattern, all set position lines of calculations, right? So it's a central system that's set up in your setting, right? See how it rotates all at once? All right, so once the spinnacle line rotations, clocking centers comes in form to an E form, to Ethereum. It sets course centers and platforms over 144 and flux over lines and position lines with its compass. Directing ground centers on sequence and course centers. Platforms over lines of EQ, cross lines of quantum Q. And that comes into XR line rotations into line communication of Bitcoin. On center, on sequence, on pi through constellation grounds. Sets travels with point lines of graph and period line and outline course centers in Ethereum rotation system in rotation. Travis points lines of graph has a course centers calculations. So you get embedding system in position on 5 triangulations, split lines on anomalies, spin lines, speedometers over rotation lines of grounds. On center, on central lines, and communication lines of pi, that correlates the communication of simulation core, the infrastructure systems, to its adaptation of force direction of time frame. So it's calculation ground centers and calculation line directions. So in that position location and setting, now understanding the ledger comes the lines of frequency pattern. 3 centers and scales of communication clock lines, centers of travel. Has direct lines, open sequence, open panel. Particle lines, centers streaming. Directs course centers in location setting. That comes into the anti-carrying. Anti comes in. X8000 picks up the block shares. Time shares over lines into calls. Formulate course centers in 1/6 lines and 1 over flush. Proximity location application line centers into XRC. Now that's a platform to line connection equity that processes your course centers and commodities. That's an infrastructure location in your box frames. Triangulation course centers into cubical lines. So all you guys are creating is Rubik's cubes of cubes. Now that core lines attractions, when that's liquidized in position, it changes the lines of the antimantle to the anticarrier. The X2000 picks it up and goes to the helter-skelter. That mind shifts the lines anomalies that process your system to your properties. Directing ground centers on sequence, on communication, on pi. Okay? On sequence, all in balance. So it's very powerful when you come into that center location of systems. Now, next in charter waves, it gets a lot more complicated, but a lot more fun how you use your own setting of your own e-transfers, transactions over lines of your CODs, your CDs, or anything you get position of, which is an X-Flight scanner. Okay, an X-Flight scanner is position your FAA into your flight manifest. And how you use that is an infold to an outfold, which correlates the calculation set into E factors over lines of outgoing mail to incoming lines of travel. So it's position of platforms in your pyramid line that rotates the cycles into position location astral projection. Okay, as a high signal lines of grounds and flux over lines, 3 centers of measure, 4 centers of scale, and set communication system in row graph screens. Centralized course centers, decentralized system. Okay, tablets and templates in location of grounds and sequence. Each window frame is a box frame. So we take those box frames and we liquidize the crystalline box frame location setting to all of those attractions. Directing non-line centers, now we can add flux line rotations and travels of QR lines of 1, process lines, direct lines, and E force line connects to E factors over screen. Directing ground centers on sequence and center operation lines, E transfers, transactions over pi, and 3 central line communication setting its service. Okay, so it's very powerful how we come into our own financial system, all through setting, through embedding, all through traction, all through provision. So all you're doing is you're decentralizing, centralizing, and you're creating central blocks, okay, into time blocks, time shares, time calculation times pi. Your communication lines, the universal core, liquidizes everything in set lines of communication setting, a box frame, and location. Process position location settings liquidizes everything through your assets in line communication system, all through flux and all through travels in travel communications, right? Cubical line rotation, set travels, X2000 comes in. I'm just getting you guys a hard lines of communication, how to process this, okay? Picks up the block shares into time shares in location system and particle streams. Change the particle line shares of the parables that rotates the server location of each transfer's location of transaction. Directing ground centers on sequence, on communication, on pi. Now, as it's going through its block shares, it goes into line communication of calls, right? Calls are lines of 1 shares. So we go in 1/3 line ground and set position of 1 film line strip. And then we come into our own site calculation setting, right? 1/3 line rotations, 24 over 1 setting. Okay, so that's in block shares times square times pi. Then we get position lines of, we can go into 36 lines in deposits, into 1 flux in travel communication. Okay, So there's so many ways you get in position. So you can change the block square utes and put them in the box frames. Okay, 24 lines, center over lines of flux, 36 lines of scale, and e-transfers and transactions over lines, and flux over lines, and XR line 1. That process lines of indication sending off their travel. So the core units come in position of a clocking system that has a zero calculation setting that neutralizes everything and crystallizes everything to your deposits of assets and set lines of communication setting. Okay, very powerful stuff. So this is just a basic infrastructure how you come into your own pyramid activation line that comes from the grounds up and set position your systems, how you basically come into levels into your crystalline direct lines in your set position of its travel. And set calculation. Okay? So as it comes in position, it deports, okay, so all lines of distributions to export. Now, in that line core center sets initial lines of point lines of graph. Let's get into film strips over flight. So we've got 13 scale, and let's get into 2 frames. Let's get into 24 line into XR1 equals center. Okay, all right, so that's a block share. Now we split lines of 3 centers of travel and 3 lines of stripping. Okay, so we centralize course centers, and we basically right away, we take the 13 lines of scale, neutralize it, and it goes into its infrastructure, which is its film strip of its universal lines, has a core deposit that sets lines of course centers, that puts process line into silicone. Silicone neutralizes settings into all position of crystalline, which is a KR center. That KR center opens all signals. We get 3 lines of flux over line and quantum flux. Process lines of indications over travel. Okay, that comes in position. All its calculation line centers to anti-mantle and anti-carrion. Now that sets lines of charge makes lines of flight over lines. It puts all deposits of core line core centers to E-carts. That puts you in X-rated core centers location X lines of charger. Sets calculation setting and process calculation system to helter-skelter in travel communications. So this is a line core centers that puts all communication of balance and set lines of sequence. So we had flux charge mechanism lines of 1, process lines of 3, and line core centers in travel. Okay, so the central setting, the X8000 is on standby in 3 central lines and deposits. So this is the AI bots. Now the AI bots are the filtering system that are registers location system in its ledger, sending lines of screen adaptation and travel. It correlates the communication to its position. They set lines of distributors, line core centers, import and export, and 3 lines of set lines of travel. Sets coordinates of communication setting. X charterways, process lines of setting of 13 scale, position of 14 measure. Now I can change the ledger. Line core centers and direct lines of link across the line core centers of its clocking system with 0 calculation. So all you have to do is understand how to liquidize everything out of carbon into crystalline into antimantle, and its surface of location setting to your blockchains, time shares, time calculations, and your properties of design. X box lines, rotation lines of grounds, and charterways of communication TV line centers. The operates line sequence sets position of film strips, puts 13 lines of charterways, set position of 24 lines of one line cycles in line screen adaptations. That's an RR line center rotation X line 1 line. Process course centers and communications of 4 centers of travel of an indication of e-transfer or transaction. It's very complicated stuff, but it's a lot of fun when you understand how to get into the universal stream of multi-levels of the mind adaptations and your financial gain of set calculations. Okay? Very complicated, but it's a lot of fun. All right, so what I'm saying right now is very confusing to your mind because you're not adapting the system of your own system and traction first. So you have to identify how you use your own set lines in your banking system, your financial institutions, your deposits, your e-transfer, your transactions, your CDs, your CODs, basically how do you see your trades and bonds, your position, your e-transfers, e-transactions, you can actually see your lines positions. It's mostly understanding your flight manifolds because that puts all process registration pass into the ledger. Now this is offline setting and position online set lines travels. So you got red lines of setting, process lines of yellow, and process lines of green. 3 central line course centers, circuitry course centers, and its highways over flux. So 3 central lines of flux over 3, over lines of central line course centers, and position lines its tablet through pi. Process indicates line ground centers on set location of systems all through transaction in set calculations. And set lines, efflux line, rotation lines, and grounds in sequence. All right. So it routes the routers and three centers of sanctions into assets that liquidizes everything, locates the system, and travels in point lines of graph of your structures, of your commodities, of your set communications. Right there in set position structure, right? That comes in line course centers, indirect lines, how you communicate your systems through your commodities. Okay, and transactions over E factors over screen. Okay, so it looks complicated because it is, but you have to understand how to understand it, how to liquidize the assets, location, and crystalline. And again, you can set line position, but you're always working with carbon. You're always working lines of silicone. Silicone retracts the position, location, and retransactions, and location and configuration lines, position locations to its ledger. Set course center line communications to a system, the crystalline, that neutralizes every locations to setting. Now, this is anti-mantle line rotation lines, so anti-carrion. Crossing angles into your transformation system, which is a transact location information panel that process locations how it comes in a line position to its Jupiter. Jupiter is line rotation setting to your information system, which is your delta heading. Process lines and direct lines, of course, centers, three centers of travel through transaction, location, and transition. Inside line condition setting, process line security, which is lines of Pluto, that centralizes the course centers of center ops, that sets the company's rotation lines of grounds into its position location its travel. Inside calculation line centers, box frames, triangulation frames. Sets course center information structures and design lines set location deposits. These are deposits and set lines of travel. Okay? So it's extremely confusing, but it's a lot more fun when you understand how to use it through your universal settings. Okay, in position of Neptune. And Neptune comes in all settings. So let's start this line communication to a setting through an umbrella. Let's get the umbrella set up. Okay, you start with that set calculations, right? So all you're doing is laser line locks, and you're creating platforms of properties and travel. Okay, so you got property over here, property over here, property over here. So you put in lacing line course centers as communicates to its system, all through calculations. So each one you set position adds a block share times calculation times pi. Right? So each one picks up all lines position when you're done in position of liquidization setting, all through communication to its system. So as calculation ground centers on sequence on communications. Now, sometimes the mothership comes in, right, to see what's going on with your transactions through its transition. So it's all about understanding how to pick up the deposits in its E-cart. Now, E-cart is a flush line to a quantum U. So a quantum U is a line course center to an umbrella that process implications to a jump start. And that calculated modified to your J lines equals lines, K lines and 1. So K is crystalline. So you just get used to it, right? C is lines of all calculation lines. Corporation line course centers. Now the corporation is all based on how you see it through transaction, E factors over line or reflex over flash. Sets course centers, directed lines, triangulation, equals lines, 3 block shares. Okay, 3 block shares and travel communications. Okay? So it's really interesting how you come into that line centers in your set position location to your betting system. Okay? And then you have your timeline share, which is your clocking share, which is a rotation share, which is a communication lines to its commodities, location setting to your economic system and set lines of communication. Okay? It's very fast track location to its provision locations, your equities. You know, how to use your liquidation lines of your assets. 3 central line communications or pyramids that set 3 grounds and graph screen location setting and chemical line rotations. Drafting grounds on sequence on communications on pi is set calculations. Okay? It's pi through a centralized decentralized system. So you're taking all pieces of pi and you're basically liquidizing everything through its assets and turning it out of its carbon and put it in position to its settings. Correlate the clocking line centers as square root. That's 24 equals lines, equity over lines equals capita. Now that's line course centers and sanctions, location of escrow. It's set travel. Okay? So it calculates and modifies how you see that line position locations. But everything has a measure scale that you balance out into your geometric lines and your sacred geometries. Now it has set position location systems in all different lines of communications, right? Your company shares. Okay, these are your properties of transaction, of transition inside calculations, all through box rank. Okay? So each one has an equity of pi that crosses line signals, location setting, the decentralized and centralized systems into polarities, location setting, a calculation. Okay? Sets the time of centers, and it liquidizes everything to its set position 24, crystalline, anti-mantle, and position of anticaryon into helter-skelter. Comes into a calculation setting to a cloud that centralizes your system in position of liquidization to your assets. And the cloud goes inline position locations to all settings, process lines of the grounds, powers, and atmospheres, and its highways, and it neutralizes every location setting, comes into its highways and travel. The perimeters, location setting, process lines of 4 centers of flux, the process line course centers E factors over line, flux over screen over quantum Q, and rotational line connection system, all through tractions. In that direct lines of link, process line position location 24 scale, 48 measure, 72 lines anomaly, and 144 flux and line communication transaction transition. So that's 4 lines of flux, E factors over line, and that's where it communicates online centers in position. But you have to stand the offline chart away to come into the position of the ledger. Ledger line rotates the clocking lines of foundation to your earth line that centralizes its deposits, that neutralizes every location setting, that liquidizes your assets location to a universal system, that centralizes your systems off through calculations. Okay, so that just gives you adaptation line positions, how you come in your own universal system, how you financial setting. Okay? It's like, woo, where's this coming from? Where's it going? Okay. So many ways of looking at it, but you have to understand how to process through it. Distributions, line condition setting, import, export. It's very powerful when you come at that setting, guys. Okay? But you're always working with that. You just turn the carbon into silicon, then you're in 24 cycle, and then you're in Ethereum lines. Okay, that process lines of L lines of 1 over C. So you get an LLC equals in position location, manual alter set location setting. Adaptation line course centers into centralized. Set lines of D factors over line center into equalines 1/3 over graph, 1/6 over ground, 1/8 over triangulation, and 1/5 over signal, and 24 line signals over calculation over pi. Okay, Ethereum, and Ethereum. 3 levels in set lines of sequence. Platform A, platform B, platform C through capita. Okay? So it's all about understanding, bringing everything down to one number, 0, 1. 0, 1 is 1. Okay? So we centralize this, and it's set position negative over positive, positive over negative. There it is. There's your time share. Boom. Okay? Now, we take the equilibrium, the process of classification, setting, and travel, right? Then we set up the betting system, okay, 3 centers, outline centers, and communication ground centers to your commodities locations. And then we add flight charterways into location grids and set lines calculation system. And then we set up your pie charts in your set position location settings to your E flights and position lines of flights, your navigation screens, adaptation of clockings into your ledger and travel communication. Okay? All right. So it's about understanding how this all works in set lines of form, an echo form. So once we understand how this all works through decentralizing centralized system, everything gets a lot more easier, ebb and flow, right? Through transaction. But you understand your outer links to your outer spectrum come into your outgoing mail. Outgoing mail transfers into incoming mail in set position 3 central line settings. So we got blocking shares of calls, data formation lines of sheets, the balance sheets, and data formation lines of holographic line setting. 3 central line course centers, inline course centers directions into flux over screen, adaptation of travel of communication to its commodity. Okay? So it has the balance sheets over lines, echo forms, echo Ethereum, rotation line grounds. I'll do 1/6 measure into property share, time share over calculations, time screen, into 1 position, 1 setting, in transaction to E factor of E transfer. It's already set in calculation, right? So the mothership comes in. Okay, she's the mother load, right? She takes off all signals and graphs the screens in pixelation over sequence, over grounds, in position. It creates the tablets in the summary content and location ground centers and sequence to its clocking system and travels a point lines graph and your echo flights and screen locations to ionospheres, directing on center line communications to convergence setting flywheels and rotation and circulation of grounds that puts your position of transactions at E factors over a set calculation. All right, so it has an ebb and flow line centers, and it sets all communication strippings and film strips of design. It sets echo flights, echo line centers, and universal line rotations and travel communications. Okay, so that's how it all works in set calculations. Okay, through echo forms. All right, so hopefully you get a better understanding of how this all works location to your systems. Okay, and it rotates in all lines of cycle through yin and yang. So this is just a basic understanding. I know it's very complicated for you guys to understand these things, but this is how it's all set up. Okay, you set it up, but you recognize you already know how to set up. So the more you understand this, the more you understand what's going on, the more everything comes in position of quantum flux, where it changes their location to its ionospheres, location setting, to its adaptation system. So in that position, we're in flux line quantum Q. The process course sends the calculation line set location to a system in the central line course. These location lines of D factors over line, negative over lines of pi. Okay, ingent location of 0, 1. Equals lines of triangulation, box frame, liquid ice, box line, correlations, properties, E factors over lines, triangulation of E cards, travel communications of balance in your balance sheet. So that's an echo form to an umbrella that sets lines of your central system, okay, through transition. So it's very powerful. And again, another mothership comes in. Now you understand why motherships come in, right? So what they do is basically add the 3 centers of travel, 3 centers of measures, and center operation lines of scale. Okay, process position your pyramids, and then you come in your position, your film strips that put you in platforms, okay, into your central systems, all through calculations at a universal form. Okay, so, and then you have your AI bots working in distribution, vaults of communications, direct lines of grounds, your central settings to your AI bots, and of course centers into your information cycle, information panel, all through line course centers and direct lines of 2 flights, and screen adaptation of Jupiter through information panel. The operation sequence puts all communication setting. The process is the indication setting all through travel. So the Ethereum correlates the communication lines of travels in line course centers of clocking screens and location system all through calculation. Okay. So there we go. That's a basic instructions how to use an A, B, C lines of balance chart and location of balance sheet and position locations to your documentation system through your docils, and knowing how to use it through application setting to your Ethereums, all through transition, transactions, locations through E-flats, knowing exactly how to formulate and simulate your self-location, your alphabetical line centers, and location system, all through set calculation of your properties and set design. Okay? So it's very powerful how we see this in line positions, guys. Okay, you have your own set position on Ethereum that comes in echo forms, echo flights, echo screens, all set calculation screen locations to your adaptation systems, all within settings of your platforms, and travel calculations through distribution. Okay, all together, all in sequence. All right, so we're now in the quantum flux and position locations. QR line centers XYZ. Okay, see you guys in 5.